there has been and there will be organizational manipulation of science.
So in your opinion, how do you think some of these technologies may impact research integrity and the reproducibility of scientific finding?
I think it is harmful for us to disassociate technology from the humans that create it.
So in your opinion, what are some of potential solutions or best practices that could be implemented to ensure that preprints are a reliable source of scientific information?
I think that we can apply a lot of the automated checks at the preprint stage. We can actually check to see if an author has an established history, if they are maybe collaborating with people who have an established history, if they don't.
Hello and welcome to Insight Exchange, Conversations Shaping Academic Research. I'm your host, Nikesh Gosalia. One of the cornerstones of research worldwide is research integrity. That is because both public trust and public perception are anchored by research integrity, ensuring that discoveries are genuine, reproducible, and reliable. Upholding this integrity is paramount as it safeguards against misinformation and guarantees that innovations and decisions are grounded in verifiable evidence. With the advent of generative AI, which can fabricate convincingly realistic data and content, the imperative for stringent research integrity grows even stronger, necessitating a heightened vigilance to differentiate genuine findings from AI-generated facades. With us today to talk about research integrity and other issues in academic research, we have Dr. Leslie McIntosh, the Vice President of Research Integrity at Digital Science. An academic who transformed into becoming an entrepreneur, Dr. McIntosh stands at the forefront of battling mis- and disinformation in science. With her brainchild, Ripeta, now a beacon in detecting trust markers of research manuscripts, she's collaborated with global institutions from NASA to the World Congress on Research Integrity. Get ready for an enlightening conversation about ensuring the truth and quality in scientific world. Welcome, Dr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Nikesh, for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. So I did come across an article, and so let me start by asking you about the time you turned into a detective and the post that became the most read one on Retraction Watch, I believe. So a researcher with 160 plus papers who had committed massive research fraud. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me give you just a little bit of background of what led me there, and then I'll dive in. So, as you know, I developed a company called Ripeta that looked at the reproducibility of science from a publication standpoint. And then when you're looking at reproducibility, we went, well, you could dive down into it and look at more granular level or look broader. And so then it was important to look at the transparency of research practices and communication, our ethics statements being stated, our funding statements. It doesn't pertain necessarily to whether something could be reproduced or not. It just adheres to whether something is trustworthy or not. And then we started looking at authorship of papers and whether authors were real or not. And two of these things came into play on this one. The first, one other thing, is that Ripeta then became part of digital science, and the algorithms that we helped develop at Ripeta, those trust markers then were integrated into dimensions. That becomes a key part as well. So on that, this happened just because somebody on Twitter at the time was very upset that their paper had been plagiarized. And I went, oh, I want to see if I can look at the two papers and I can tell the difference with trust markers, whether it's trustworthy or not. And the suspect paper had a funder listed, but it was a fake funder. And there are unique funding identifiers, just like we have unique researcher identifiers and things like that. And I couldn't find it. So I dug a little bit deeper and there wasn't one. And then I looked at the network of publications of the one person that kept coming up that was on that first one. And then that just, I pulled on a thread and it uncovered quite a bit. Now, to be clear, I didn't know that the person had plagiarized everything. That's not what the trust markers did. What it did was it brought up a suspicious network that then I contacted the university where the person was at and said, this is suspect. And they took the investigation. They did all of that work. So then I think I'm probably jumping to a later question that you have. What that then has developed into is, could we then find those networks without having to be tipped off by something on Twitter or some other social media? And the answer is, yeah, we can start finding networks. And unfortunately, there's a lot more there. So
thanks for sharing that, Leslie. And I really find this fascinating. And I remember at some point of time this year, I was talking to Elizabeth Bick, and she was also talking about image manipulation and how did she get into this and doing this full time and being really passionate about this. Just for the understanding of listeners, I mean, I know that it's a very obvious question, but why would a researcher be encouraged to do this in the first place, knowing the kind of risks that these kind of manipulation and bad practices carry? Why would they still be encouraged to take this risk?
I think that's the case, is that what have been the risks for them to take it when they were doing this? When it comes to image manipulation, before Elizabeth Bick, and there are others on image manipulation, but obviously she's the most well-known, who was really looking at the image manipulations. So if the risk is very low and or the consequences are very low, even if you get caught and you have pressure to publish, then why not take that risk? I'm not saying it's right, but it's like art fraud in that art fraud has come a long way in detecting it because techniques have, but then the people who commit it get more sophisticated. Why would somebody do this if they are under a lot of, if it's an individual, they could be under a lot of pressure to publish. And a lot of places are like that. Institutions are. I think we know about perverse incentives. It might be for prestige, that they want to seem better than they are. But the other things that I want to bring up, besides why would an individual do this, is we're not just looking from within the river of scientific information in the ivory tower anymore. There has been and there will be organizational manipulation of science. I think the tobacco industry is probably one of the best known industries that has influenced the scientific literature. The other is governments who influence it as well, which is a concern for various governments have different expectations and different desires, shall we say. So there's three levels there: the individual, the organization, and then the political government level.
Wow, that's great. I mean, I think I'd not thought about the three different levels. So that's yeah. So and so now just maybe talking about just so many of these fraudulent practices happening. I'm just wondering, where do you start, and how do you even begin to maybe cull them out to bring trust back into the process? Because, like you said, all of these paper mills are getting more and more sophisticated. There is fraudulent practices happening at these different levels. So where does one start?
I think that you start somewhere. And obviously, as researchers, what we do is a literature search to see what's already out there. And if you do a search to see what's already out there, not just within the scientific literature, you already see that there's organizations like the World Congress on Research Integrity that has been working on research integrity. So you look for places that are already working and leading in the areas that you can. I will say that Australia, I've had the great opportunity of going to Australia and working with some of their academic institutions, and they have these amazing research integrity academic groups of 40 or 30 to 40 people, which is amazing. Especially, I'm originally from the States, and that's just not heard of in the States. But it is practiced in other places as well. So I'm just calling out Australia. I've had the great opportunity of being there, but I know that there are some Eastern African countries, when I've spoke to someone in Kenya, that are also using that model as well to really hone in on research integrity and focus on it. So your question is, where do you start? What I started with was a taxonomy, and I've decided what is to really keep focused on what is it sorry about that, what is within my scope and what's not. And what's within my scope is looking across research being communicated and what are the ethical practices that we expect across research, and focus in on that, because so many of the things that we do within research are not codified. They're not laws, they're guidelines. And for us as an ecosystem, one of the things that also needs to happen is for us to work together. So where do I start? I start looking at what's going right, what can we do better, and what's going wrong, and working with all of the stakeholders and trying to communicate with all of the stakeholders about what we can do to strengthen our ecosystem, because it will take all of us to do this.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree with you. And before delving deeper into this topic, Leslie, I just wanted to go back to when you started your career. And in many ways, this probably would not be like a mainstream career to start with. And you almost created a space for yourself. So what really motivated, what prompted you to do this? If you can talk a little bit about your journey from the time you entered academia to Ripeta to, what you're essentially doing now.
Sure. So my PhD is in epidemiology and biostatistics within public health. Public health is a very broad field where you could work in a lab or you could work in the community, and you can work all places in between. Truth is, I loved data. Data science wasn't really a thing back then. So you go into statistics, which I think any data scientist should have anyway, and work in applied statistics. That led me to working on data at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, which led to becoming the center director for the Center for Biomedical Informatics. Now, why is that important? Because at that time, we were starting to aggregate data, aggregate all of the hospital data, the research data. It becomes very sensitive. It becomes very powerful to have that. And there was a lot of meetings with attorneys over this time because of the legal issues with that. And we were trying to make this research data available for the researchers at the medical institution to be able to use to help make things better. Noble practice, but that's hard. They didn't necessarily understand the data. They didn't understand how to then cite the data. And here are these, what I consider great researchers that weren't making their work reproducible. So it really started with, what did I have in control to help these researchers that I worked with, that I helped give data? How did I make their lives easier and better so they could focus on the question at hand and not be burdened by the data or the legal issues or things like that? The other thing that happens during that time is you also see all of the practices of people, good, bad, ugly. You see everything. And so it was an opportunity to try to automate some checks and automate some instructions for them to make their work easier and better. So that's really how I got started. And then, quite frankly, I was afraid I wasn't going to be promoted and move up the academic ladder if I wasn't cited in this big database that I had. And kind of, humorously, I didn't, because I started a company and moved out, and here I am. So
Thank you for sharing that, Leslie. And I think it's brilliant because I remember, like, we were just talking. We probably met 6, 7 years back, and you've stayed just so focused in just one particular area. It's so easy to get distracted. We know that research integrity has always been really important, but we've also had so many other disruptions and changes that have happened in the industry. And but you've stayed laser focused, and today I think everyone's talking about it and realizing the importance of it. And so yeah, that's really fascinating, and thank you for sharing. Talking about automation, and we all know there is a lot of conversation happening around AI tools. Obviously, one of the most spoken about language models like a ChatGPT. So, in your opinion, how do you think some of these technologies may impact research integrity and the reproducibility of scientific findings? And as we all know, there are potential benefits, but there are some challenges as well. So, how do you see this whole space, and what is your view on use of technology, use of AI?
So I'm going to answer the last question first, which is what do I think about technology? And I think it is harmful for us to disassociate technology from the humans that create it, because the humans that create it are embedded within the codes that have built it and produced the technology. The biases that we have, assumptions of whomever the programmers are made. So it's not something that is all knowing or all wise by any stretch of the imagination. On the other hand, there's some great things to it. I mean, let's think about spell check. I have some dyslexic individuals in my family, and spell check was a game changer for them. It helped them communicate with where they were embarrassed to do it before. ChatGPT, my friends who are non-native English speakers talk about using these large language models and how much it helps them get emails composed more quickly. Their written English is so much, has been so much improved because of this, and they have relaxed a little bit. Now, in speaking to them, it's also interesting because there is a trade-off in learning some improving the spoken language, but that's a whole different issue. And so I will leave that for them. It's just been really nice. And we don't think about using spell check anymore as cheating. And I think we need to think about using these large language models as how does this help edit some of the work and clarify some of the work. Now, obviously, any of this can be taken and misused as well when you're trying to make something that wasn't yours and send it off as if it was yours. And therein lies the problem. Here's where I think we should take a very different look when it comes to checking research. So if we think about research as a river going into the ocean, just bear with me on this one, right? The ivory towers have opened, open research, more stuff is coming out, but we don't have filters on that. So instead of going, is this water? Is this not water? Let's put in filters in place and look, and filter out what should water look like. So in that, that's where when we developed the trust markers of reproducibility, transparency, and authorship, we're putting in those elements that should be there in communication and are there. So yes, even ChatGPT, I have asked it to go in and write. I asked it to write on kangaroos. I just returned from Australia. It was a lovely trip. Write about kangaroos, and I wanted an ethics statement and a data availability statement in there. They were in there. It was in the paper. But the ethics statement put in a fictitious ethics approval board. There was no ethics number in there. So those are when you start getting down into how do we trust it, those elements weren't there. So it didn't matter whether the English sounded good. The integrity elements were not there, those trust markers. Same with data availability statement. It was missing things as well. And then if you go and read the article, it has some ridiculous things about hopping locomotion, which is actually quite funny, but I've never heard that before, and neither have my Australian friends. So There are ways to check.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, to start with, actually, the example of the river and the ocean was fantastic, Leslie. So if you have such similar ones, please do, because it just makes it easier, of course, for all of us to understand in the context of where we are. Specifically talking about the academic publishing industry, we've been hearing a lot around the paper mills and the practices becoming more sophisticated. We've also been hearing about a lot of development of automated tools, and at the same time we've been hearing two different maybe kind of viewpoints. One is that okay, it has to be 100% automated because that's how we can do this at scale, we can do this faster. We've already got journal editorial offices doing so many other checks, etc. But there's another viewpoint to say that maybe technology alone cannot solve this problem. So maybe we might need to have something which is slightly more hybrid in nature, and some sort of a human check. So in your opinion, how do you see this? How can maybe say a particular publisher or a society, or for that matter a journal, think about research integrity and having something which is very solid in place? Because I'm sure there are lots of folks who are having sleepless nights if there is any journal delisting to happen, or just bad publicity, and we are seeing quite a few come out as well. So what's your opinion on that, Leslie?
I am definitely on the hybrid side. I don't think that we should leave anything to complete automation. What's the purpose of our thinking if we're doing that? I fully believe in computer augmented human decision making. We use computers to help us filter through the phenomenal amount of publications that are coming in. We help um, and we need to be thinking about the ethical approach to that as well, just to be clear on that. This is not to build algorithms to filter out people because they happen to use a commercial email like gmail.com or 123.com because they're from certain countries that it's harder to have an academic email and use that. So we build computer algorithms to help the filtering than humans to make the decision about it. In my kangaroo example, which is seriously made up from the large language model, even if it could pass with all of the trust markers, then it would still, well, it wouldn't, excuse me, it wouldn't. Then it would be easy for a human to take that and read it and go, yes, this isn't actually telling me anything. I can make a decision about it. Now, a couple of things happen with that. One is we can speed up some of the checks that just they need to happen. We need to get past them. And then we can focus on the science, the research, the question. And I want to be clear that when I use science, I'm using this in a very historical term for it. I don't want to get into whether it's, hard sciences or soft science or whatever. This is science in the philosophical sense of the word. So definitely on the hybrid side that we need both. And I don't think that the humans that are working as editorial in the editorial phase are going anywhere. I hope that they can start focusing more on the content rather than things that we take for granted now. We don't have to count words anymore or count pages. That's done for us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with you, Leslie. I think I see. I'm leaning more towards the hybrid model as well, and I think in many ways that helps. If we are saying that if the paper mills are evolving all the time, then maybe that human check helps to identify those, and then maybe that becomes in future a system which could be automated perhaps. But I think that level of intelligence and that level of check is definitely something which is needed. Just I was reflecting back on your previous example, and you mentioned about building in those filters. Any thoughts on, so how do we build those filters? How can we kind of just create a system around it?
Yeah. So The way that I've always approached things is to look at things manually, to understand the process, to see what we can automate within the process for checks, to see which technologies we have, then to run it, right? We test it. One of the things I want to be very clear about testing, though, is we need to not only see whether a computer can do what the human does, but can it do it in an ethical manner? Because humans can be very unethical as well, even or with unintentional biases and whatnot. So can we build these automated algorithms, these protocols? Can we automate them and do it in an ethical way? And what we have to do then is actually take and have humans check what we were doing. Back to the filter in the river. If you've ever tried to strain anything in the kitchen before, right? Sometimes there's more liquid because there's not enough holes for the things to get through, and then it defeats your purpose, right? Because you're not getting that sauce or that water through in this point. Those are the things that we need to do. And I know that it sounds, I don't know, maybe anticlimactic in the days of AI and algorithms and everything, but we have to have the human component in building these filters. Now, the question is, what are the filters? And obviously I have a bias here because I developed a company that developed some of these filters, but they're not the only ones, right? This is really at a high level. These trust markers are at a very high level of publication. They're not looking at images. They are not looking at, right now, we're not looking at certain data, but we probably will once that's made available. So it's just going to take a lot of people in a lot of different places in order to, I think, protect the trustworthiness of science that we deserve. To get back to your original point too, Nikesh, of being able to understand the wonderments of the world and trust what we are understanding as we can, from now, right? We can only understand what we can with the information that we have, and that evolves.
I remember reading your article on imposters and impersonators in preprints. How do we trust authors in open science? This was published on the Scholarly Kitchen blog, I think in 2021. In this article, you discuss the issue of imposters and impersonators in preprints, which can pose a challenge to ensuring research integrity. So in your opinion, what are some of potential solutions or best practices that could be implemented to help address this issue and ensure that preprints are a reliable source of scientific information? We all know, preprints are growing in importance. We know its importance during the whole pandemic as well. So how do we ensure that, they can be trusted?
I think that we can apply a lot of the automated checks at the preprint stage, right? Before we can actually check to see if an author has an established history, if there are if they are maybe collaborating with people who have an established history, if they don't. So there are ways that we can check the author. You can check, and some of the preprint servers already do this. They want the data availability statement, they want an ethics statement, and they check for those things. So some of that we can already check. I want to be clear here, though, that with preprints, I have just become a proponent of peer review. And I know peer review has been questioned a lot, and there's a lot of potential faults in peer review because people are burdened by it. And I don't want to get into whether it should be paid or not. I just want to talk about the value of having peer reviewers there. And this is what the preprints don't offer. It offers information to the public at a very rapid pace. Part of that public is the scientific community. Part of it is not. And if something is under fire from the broader non-scientific community before it goes under scientific rigorous review, then that's a potential problem. And we've seen that for political views, especially when it came to COVID and during the time of that. So I would say the automated checks, as much as we can, should be at the preprint level to help trust the integrity of the communication. It doesn't mean that the science should be trusted yet. It just means that, do they have the other parts as well? And just a follow-up on this really quickly, because it was yesterday that it came out in Retraction Watch that there was a fictitious author that is on 12 published manuscripts. So these aren't even preprints. So this mysterious Dragan Rodriguez, so two names from very different parts of the world, but who knows? They aren't associated with the institution in their papers, so it's a bit of a mystery to be solved.
Wow. And just while you were sharing that example that just happened so recently, Leslie, in your experience, have you witnessed something which is, completely shocking and at the same time really sophisticated, or any other example that comes to your mind in terms of how research integrity and reproducibility have been compromised and the potential impact that this has had on the scientific community?
I can tell you the one that has been the most disheartening of late, and I'm tying back to individual, organizational, and governmental. And there was a special issue, a research topic within Frontiers. And for any of the listeners, I'm assuming they're going to be familiar with research topics or special issues where a guest editor comes in and it's on a specific topic that the community tends to want to know about, and they find people to write papers and the peer reviewers. So it gives these guest editors quite a bit of power. And we've seen within the community where that has been abused, where people come in and just get bogus papers published because they're wanting to cite their papers. How much that information is used, I don't know. This one, though, really hit me because two of the papers should not, from my perspective, should not have been published because of conflicts of interest. And they were published, and it was for political gain and for an ideological, I'm trying to be very scientific about this, but ideological, political gain. And that organization is that a lot of the peer reviewers came from, and a guest editor, and the authors that are associated with have influenced cases, as in law, within the United States. And that's very disheartening, because then anytime you see that manipulation that affects lives, it's very disheartening. We've seen that in Alzheimer's, where some data was fabricated. It's absolutely horrific. People's lives are negatively affected by this. And so, unfortunately, I've just seen that. I shared with you a preprint on it, and I think we could share with the listeners that preprint. Just know that we're still editing it, because it is a preprint and it hasn't been under peer review.
Okay, no, definitely. We'll thank you for sharing that, Leslie, and we'll share it so that other listeners can be aware of that as well. So, yeah, I know it's one of when we were just chatting a few minutes back, one of the things that you spoke about is trying to foster collaboration and communication between a diverse set of stakeholders. And like you correctly mentioned, it is not just up to a few stakeholders to manage this. I mean, we're talking about funding agencies, we're talking about publishers, academic societies, research institutes, researchers themselves, of course, journalists, policymakers. And so, in your opinion, again, how do we try and, one, maybe what are some of the challenges in bringing all of these stakeholders together, and what might a potential solution look like?
That's a really good and very tough question. So very, very well done. So back to one of the questions that you asked me is, where do you start? And I think that each group within the community needs to define their space and the gaps and their responsibility, because the responsibility is not just on one group. Each group has responsibilities, and it's not okay to say, well, that's the researcher's problem, or that's the institution's problem, or that's publishers. I mean, and you can keep going. What is the responsibility for each group, and what are the ethics in which you should abide by at that level? So that's just kind of at the individual groups. But then your next question is, how do we work across those groups? And it's one of the reasons that I love my new position as the VP of Research Integrity at Digital Science, is because that's part of what I'm trying to help figure out. How do we make those connections? How do we discuss between publishers and funding institutions, which they've started doing that at the Research Data Alliance. I know that there's some of that going on at other organizations. By the way, the Research Data Alliance is an international organization focused on data, but they get different stakeholders together. Different groups are working between science and policy. I'm more familiar with some of the things going on in the United States. Even if I'm living in London at this point, I haven't quite transitioned my mind to understand everything else. But at the Harvard Institute for Policy, and it's the Shorenstein Institute, I believe is the name of it, but we can make sure that we have it absolutely correct for the listeners. They're working between policy, they're working with journalists, and working with academic institutions. So it's these groups and these podcasts like yours that are asking the questions of how do we work together. The take-home message on this is figure out your responsibility, and let's take that responsibility, because it is not okay to say that the onus is on somebody else. It is just not okay if we want to hold on to trusting science and the scholarly information at which we produce and we believe in.
In terms of, having worked closely with publishers, with academic societies, are there any specific strategies that come to your mind, Leslie, to promote transparency in the research process and reduce the risk of bias or conflict of interest?
So I have been very impressed by a couple of societies that and I know there's more than just a couple. Societies give researchers a home. They give them a place, they give them an identity. And for those who might listen to this podcast and don't understand that researchers actually are social in our own little way, these are the places that allow that socialization, and it's a way for people like you and me to come and meet one another, come from different perspectives. And the important part of those societies specifically is to guide their membership in how they would like to see to their research and how to make it easier. So a few societies have worked on creating data availability statements so that their researchers can pick from them and understand how that works. So there's some consistency, because as you know, societies also publish journals, and so they wanted to make sure that they had some consistency there. I think it would be good for there to be, this isn't just on publishers or societies, but for there to be a database of conflicts of interest like there are. I don't know if it would go into ORCID. I don't know if it's out of their scope, but just as we have professional identifications for us, that we also can list the declarations that we need to make so that people can be clear about what those are. So I think that would be helpful. And I'm not trying to forget about publishers. I think they're very responsible for communicating research. I just think out of publishers and societies have kind of been forgotten about a little bit, or maybe I just haven't heard about them enough. And the longer I'm into this, the more that I feel they are so important in guiding, well, publishers are as well in this one, guiding how do you do a peer review? What are we expecting? Educating the people that you are working with, their stakeholders, to strengthen and to make research whole, which is where integrity comes from. Integral, which means the whole. So,
thank you, Leslie. Given the interconnectedness of the scientific community, where experts often share affiliations, very often attend the same conferences, or even collaborate on research, how do you think we can delineate the boundary between naturally occurring overlaps in academic networks and possibly potential conflict of interest that might compromise, say, the objectivity in the peer review process?
well, there's a prevention aspect of this, which is one, just knowing what they are, knowing what conflicts of interest that people may have, and ensuring that the review process of the communications is diverse enough from a scientific standpoint. I want to be very clear about this. So, for instance, I just did this. I wrote a paper in a special issue, and Daniel Hook, who is the CEO of Digital Science, the company I work for, was one of the guest editors. He did not touch my paper, and I kept referring to it, and he goes, I haven't read it. I don't know. I'm like, right, okay. So one of the things that you do in these overlapping networks is to ensure that there are people outside of that network or not directly over the person that reviews that, and that there's enough other people. This also gives an opportunity in peer review for younger researchers to come in and be part of a network. There are ways of looking this to, you can look at the publication history and the working history of people to understand potential conflicts of interest. I want to recognize that there are some fields that are very niche, and it would be very hard to find people that know about the topic that you're talking about, be able to rigorously review it, and not be part of your circle. And where one of the other answers to this is then making that process very transparent. Make the reviews transparent. It's actually one of the reasons Archive does really well. That community that started it is open, and they're very rigorous about discussing the science involved. And I think that's good. I honestly like, and I know that there can be problems with anything, but I like when you know who the editors are, you know who the peer reviewers are, and I like it when the peer reviews are public. I work a lot harder on those to make sure that I clearly state what I'm looking at, the assumptions that I make when I conduct a peer review, when I know that it's going to be public. I don't think that's such a bad thing. Now, anything can be weaponized, and I just think we need to acknowledge that. So as we create this openness, what kind of filters are we going to put on it to say, these are the filters of science, this is the normal discourse that, two people that go out and are friends will also vehemently argue about very specific wording of things, and it will seem like it's antagonistic when it's not. It's scientific.
Absolutely. I know you briefly mentioned about your exciting role at Digital Science, but can you please give our listeners an overview of your role as the Vice President of Research Integrity at Digital Science and how your work contributes to the larger field of research integrity?
Thank you for asking that. It's actually a tough question because it's an inaugural role at a company that works within the research space, but I'm not at an institution, I'm not at a government agency, and I'm certainly not, my role is not just to uncover, nefarious activities that may be happening in science, although obviously, I do that because that's part of what I do. That was me before I came into this role. So what we're really looking at in this role is to improve research to help the research ecosystem to be more trustworthy, more rigorous, and more transparent across the entire ecosystem. So it is not looking at how good research happens within a laboratory. It's not looking at the micro level, it's more looking at what does research integrity look like as we move out into from that river, if you will, into the ocean of the wider world. And what does integrity look like? What does whole, trustworthy, rigorous, transparent research look like? And I am exploring that. And I am working with different stakeholders on this, where while I'm still defining this, I have a year to really come into what is that space, but where I'm really honing in on is that area between the river and the ocean, which is one of my favorite words, not because it's a beautiful word, but it's brackish water there. And I remember learning about that as a child, that I thought a river just ended and the ocean just began, and that was it. I didn't realize there's a whole ecosystem right there between the two that that's studied and has to be understood, and it's very important for our environment. That's the area that I'm trying to understand. What are the filters that need to be there before the river gets to the ocean? Once it gets out, how is it understood? But once it gets out into the public, that's not really my domain. That's it's looking at research integrity right in that space, that estuary and that brackish water, a little bit saline, a little bit freshwater.
I
That's
love,
what.
yeah, I love that, Leslie, and thank you for sharing. And if you don't mind, I'm going to try to use that as well.
Oh,
Uh,
please, please.
that's such an excellent way to just explain what exactly are the issues, how exactly are you trying to help, and in which particular area. And I'm sure the listeners would also be able to connect the dots much more easily. So thank you for really sharing that. Talking a little bit about dimensions, research integrity. Again, if you can talk and explain for the benefit of the listeners, what exactly is this about? Is it a tool? Is it automation? And how can it help address the issue of research reproducibility? Or in fact, how is it already helping address that issue?
Sure. Thank you for asking. So, as mentioned, the algorithms we developed in Ripeta to automate these checks for reproducibility, and again, these are very high level, the data availability statement, the code sharing, and whatnot, transparency, and the author checks have been automated. They've now been applied within Dimensions. Dimensions is a corpus of it's been applied to the full text publications that Dimensions has. I should be very clear about that, so that we can look in aggregate and understand what are the trends, what are places seen, and that gives us a few things. By the way, you access this either through GBQ, which is Google BigQuery, or through a dashboard. So you can, and we give different places reports as well. So what does this do? What is a dashboard? What does a report give you? Well, it gives you a view wherever you're coming from. I'm going to pick on the institutional level because I've been working with some Australian institutions. Gives them a level of how they're doing on these trust markers, broken up by different views. So what about fields of research? I can tell you that these algorithms have been applied across 33 million papers. We can look at data availability, code availability, ethics statement, funding statement, and the like. And in the health sciences, actually, they're pretty good. They're very good across their researchers. But so that's great, and they can look and go, okay, so these researchers know that they should have these pieces in a paper. So maybe we don't need to educate them as much, but also if we see a researcher that isn't doing this, why isn't that? Because it is common in that field. Interestingly enough, though, when you look at information and computer science and you can filter on papers that have to do with humans or animals, the ethics statements drop. So you're able to see things at a very large area and go, well, this is curious because if these were people in epidemiology using computer science to study something, you would know to go and get ethics approval for it. But that's an educational opportunity within computer science and information science to go. We need to up the game when it comes to ethical approval. Now, I have my theories too on that. Is that why we're having some bias in ethics when we move out of the university? Did they not get socialized to understanding that you have to go through ethical approval for using certain data? It gives us more insight right there. And then just not within dimensions, research integrity is the author check, because we do keep that separate. It's very sensitive to potentially flag someone that might have an issue, demands human verification, human checks on that. And that doesn't go into a dashboard, because we don't want to find that there are people that, for whatever reason, they're false positives on the algorithm, and that doesn't need to be public. So we're a bit more private on that part.
Got it. And one question before I had a couple of other questions on the dimensions, research integrity as well, Leslie, but just on the whole research integrity piece, how important do you think is training to ensure that we share a common view of research integrity worldwide, especially with the kind of rapid changes that are happening in the tech ecosystem? I know you referred to, some specific geographies, some specific countries maybe taking the lead over others. We know that there is a lot of kind of paper mill issues, fraudulent practices happening from some of the other geographies. So how do we, and I mean, yeah, just a question around how important is training and standardization of certain best practices worldwide?
That's a really good question. And it might be easy to just go, I think it's very important. Obviously, training is important. It's not the only thing that needs to happen. I want to be clear, though, it's not just training of the researchers. It's training of the institutions that support those researchers and understand how they're promoted. It's understanding and training and speaking with the governments and funders to understand the pressures that certain policies may cause, or the benefits that may cause that as well. So I think it's training to multiple stakeholders. It's just, there's no one silver bullet that's going to solve everything. It's going to take every piece of this. I do want to give a very good example, though, that I don't know why, I just haven't been able to give it yet, is that if you look at the country level with trust markers and who's doing the best, it tends to surprise people. So I'm going to actually ask you, just out of which country, just which continent do you think it's on?
Africa?
It is Africa.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It is Africa.
Wow.
It's Ethiopia. Ethiopia has had an interesting, ecosystem to where between what the institutions have been doing, the negotiations with publishers that require certain trust markers within their publications, the government, which is demanding it, organizations and societies which are supporting it, the researchers who are doing it, they have the best transparency of having data availability statements within their papers out of any other country, out of those four main research institutions. Now, they're just like anyone else in that, yes, those data availability statements could be better in that we need to share, state where the data are from, but we know that when people put more data availability statements in, they start to move towards having the other practices. So it's just to say that, one, you don't know who's going to do what, and it's amazing when you work together what can happen. So, and I feel like you asked the question and I'm not sure I answered it. So I just wanted to make sure that I gave that example of what's doing well.
Okay. I think, you spoke about the importance of training, but at the same time, you rightly mentioned training itself is just not going to solve this issue for us. But just talking about the example, and to be very honest, I obviously guessed the answer, but I'm also a bit surprised. And so specifically with this example, I'm just curious, how do we then, are we doing enough to showcase this as a good example? Are we sharing this enough? How can we kind of make this, set of best practices available to so many others? And in my opinion, I don't think we're doing enough, but I want to obviously hear your thoughts.
I would agree that I don't think we're doing enough, but I will tell you one of the reasons that we're working on a report on this, but I'm working with some people in Africa to make sure that I don't take their story and that it's contextualized within their environment. And so that's just honestly the summer hit, and we're all kind of, or the summer, sorry, for everyone in the Southern Hemisphere, the summertime in the Northern Hemisphere hit. And it's important to have that contextualization and understand it from their perspective. So once we have that, then we'll try to make it more public and shine the light on people who deserve this. And I think it gets to the point that different places shine in different ways. Honestly, back to your other question, just like there's different scams in different countries, I have yet to see one place that doesn't have some people that are manipulating science somehow. I haven't seen one place that doesn't have people that truly believe in doing rigorous research and searching for the truth and trying to put that out. Um, that seems to be global, even if the pressures are different in different societies, even if the way people manifest things differently, it is different. And back to your question though about should we all come to, one thing on what we should accept, maybe, but I think that's going to take time and we need to learn from different cultures. We need to working with some people in New Zealand and the Maori culture and understanding what's very important and what privacy means at a group level. That's very important. So it shouldn't, if we standardize things, it shouldn't just be on a global West standardization. It needs to be a holistic understanding. And I think that'll just evolve.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you, Leslie. Yeah. Talking about this is more futuristic and kind of a generic question, but at the same time also very specific. How do you see the field of research integrity evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And very specifically, the role that potentially dimensions research integrity is playing or can play in this evolution?
I definitely see it evolving, and perhaps I'm optimistic for my own career. And I think research integrity is the issue within research for the decade. I think it will evolve over that time as certain stakeholders come together. Truthfully, as certain world events are bound to happen, they affect research. So that's going to happen. The where dimensions comes in, it is also where tools come in, and that is thinking about how do we leverage these for good. But that's the offensive game, if you will. How do we use these to have a defensive game to protect the world that we're in? And then for my role is also helping inform and understanding the potential biases that we may embed and we know that get embedded within software tools, within algorithms, and understanding and improving those. I think that outside of science, I think it's been a horrible job of just moving on with biases just to move faster and have tools at the expense of a lot of other things. I think we need to be very careful with that in science, and I hope to be part of that solution rather than adding to the problem. But truthfully, Nikesh, this is going to be almost like an arms race when paper mills, when we figure out the pattern of paper mills, there will be another way of people gaming the system. I think we have an opportunity to, though, to shine the light on the people that are doing really well and the research that's going really well, because there are some people out there who are working really hard and they don't get noticed because they don't have the quantity of publications. They aren't meeting the metrics as they're set right now. And we have the opportunity to help influence those metrics to focus on quality.
Absolutely. Just so that our listeners, are excited and more optimistic about the near future, Leslie, are only if you can, of course, is there any particular project or initiative at either digital science or specifically dimensions research integrity that you're looking forward to, something that you can share or talk about?
I think the thing that I'm looking most forward to is finding those what I call sleeping dragons, the people that are working really hard to make their work reproducible, but don't necessarily get the attention that they deserve or they need. And I've actually brought it up when I was speaking to a couple of Australian universities, and it was very exciting to see what comes of that. I don't know. This is very much we're just discussing it. How can we use this for good? How do we improve research by looking at the trust markers and finding those people who are doing well? I will say also on a positive note, and this doesn't come out in a case because a lot of things happen and they're not to be made public because some people just mess up sometimes. And what's been nice, if taken the right way, and I've seen this with, again, a few Australian universities, is that they're able to intervene and speak to those researchers before they get on a track that gets things out of hand. And it's been really nice to see that as well. So I hope to continue doing that. I'm trying to stick on the positive things for our listeners as we move to, maybe making these checks, making them quicker so that you can get back to your research and focus on the question that you really want and not whether you have the right words or whether your data availability statement was correct or whether your IRB number was correct. Because those who've done good science, it just takes a lot of work to get all that written down. And maybe we can make that easier. And we are looking at moving towards that direction as well.
Very exciting. So as I begin to wrap up, Leslie, I have two questions. One work related, one probably non-work related. But just for the benefit of our listeners, how do you keep yourself updated with information about the industry, about anything adjacent to it as well, anything which is interrelated, interconnected? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting question because the question is, to me, how do I do that and how do I stay sane while I'm doing that? is the two things. At this point, obviously I read a lot. I have to read a lot. I still play with data. I love looking into the data. I love looking at patterns, and I will continue to do that. And then once you get known a little bit, people feed you information, which is sometimes, it's always good. Sometimes I have to remember to put it on a little note and not go down the rabbit hole right at that moment. So I can try to stay up to date. And the fact is I have to be kind to myself and realize that I will not know everything. It gets back to one of your first points though, and that is to define the scope of which I work and kind of understand, am I going outside of scope right now? And if so, then how do I get back in for work? If it's a personal thing, then it's my own time. I'm going to answer the question that you didn't ask though as well, which is, sometimes this can be just really disheartening. And we all live in the same world. We don't live in the same we all live on the same planet, I should say. We all experience things maybe a little bit differently, but many of us are tired of Zoom around the world, are tired of, calls because we like that personal interaction, but they're also good to connect us. Sometimes I besides the normal things, I just have to make sure that the world doesn't change me. And if that's all I can do in one day, sometimes that's a good day, because there are the world is changing at a rapid pace, like many of us haven't seen in our life. And holding on to our due north, to figuring out what we hold to be true, is just really important. So I try to do that as well, and have friends.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, Leslie. I think you pretty much added a different perspective to my question, which was very, very focused on, obviously, how do you keep yourself updated? But I think, this really is fascinating as well. And the non-work question that I had in mind is that when you're not thinking about world problems and problems within academia and research integrity, how do you spend your time, Leslie?
So if I really want to not think about it, I have to do something all engrossing. So I love to cook. I love to paint. I love to do things. I try to read a fluff book, what I call a fluff book, between my serious ones, or at the same time, because it just takes me out of the current world and gets me into a different one. But yeah, cooking, but come on, that ties into science, because I love experimenting with recipes to see how different flavors will work, but it's all engrossing. So I love that. And then, kind of the normal things of walking and making sure I exercise and taking care of myself. I'm very, very grateful that my children are not young, so I can do those things. I know those listeners who have young children or are taking care of parents right now, or other family members. That's a whole different ballgame. I'm very fortunate that way.
Thanks for sharing that, Leslie. And I think on that note, I mean, yeah, I am one of those. My daughter's just turning 6 next week, and it's quite a handful, but at the same time, it's a lot of fun as well. I'm just about reading kind of the fluff books that you refer to between the really serious ones. I don't know. I'm just trying this for the first time. So we went to a library with my daughter the other day, and just randomly I asked her to pick a book, and I told her, I'll just get that and I'll read that. And it was from a specific section, of course. So it wasn't one of those very serious and none of the crime thrillers or anything. It was a very easy read. And I just picked that, and I don't know. I'm going to be away for a few days, so I'm going to try that. But I've never tried that, so I'm hoping that it works for me, Leslie. Yeah.
I hope it does. I actually picked one because a friend at the office, her friend wrote it. And I said, okay, why don't and it's great. It's just a different perspective. And I need to be careful. When I say fluff, I just mean ones that can take me away from
Sure.
this world,
Yeah.
that are light read. I don't mean anything critical about the author, because those books have a place.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
hope it finds a place for you when you take a couple of days off and you can relax. And
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Leslie. I think it's just something that maybe, helps me disconnect from just the regular way of thinking or regular way of doing things. And I think that compartmentalization in some ways, just helps you come back more rejuvenated. I mean, not always and not very often you need to go to a different location or do something, completely different to really bring about that change or that freshness. It's just some of these things. So yeah, it's the first time trial for me as
absolutely. Well, good luck. 6-year olds are good.
Yeah,
That's a good age that'll hopefully let you read. And
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. So I'll just start to wrap up. In today's world where open science meets the power of AI, maintaining research integrity is more crucial than ever. This is to ensure that the democratization of knowledge isn't compromised by fabricated or misleading information. As AI tools become more advanced, they can generate realistic yet entirely synthetic data, potentially muddling genuine discoveries. It's imperative to uphold rigorous standards of research integrity so that the open dissemination of scientific findings remain trustworthy, accurate, and beneficial for society at large. I've truly enjoyed our enlightening conversation with Dr. Leslie McIntosh today, whose passion and commitment to genuine, trustworthy science shines brightly. Her insights remind us of the importance of keeping our research real in the rapidly advancing era. Thank you, Leslie, for such an engaging and informative discussion.
Thank you, Nikesh. I've enjoyed being here. This has been great.
Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and being part of this conversation. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Write to us at insightexchange@cactusglobal.com or drop a comment on LinkedIn. Your feedback, questions, and perspectives are what makes this exchange of insight so valuable.